Hello, I'm Dr. Jack McDonough, Chairman of the Advisory Board of the Henry R. Winkler Center for the History of the Health Professions at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. The Winkler Center is a medical archive, library, and exhibits gallery that encourages visitors and researchers to explore and examine the Cincinnati area's rich medical history and discover the people who have contributed to the important advances in medicine, nursing, and the pharmaceutical sciences. One of the real gems of our collection is the Video Oral History Program. The histories and stories that we have collected from many of these remarkable pioneers are fascinating. We wonder sometimes how they made their discoveries, what pushed them to become leaders in their fields, and even what their lives were like outside their offices and laboratories. Today, we're going to interview Dr. Josef Fischer, a nationally and internationally known physician, surgeon, and researcher who has made enormous contributions to the field of surgery. Dr. Fischer served as the Christian R. Holmes Professor of Surgery and Chairman of the Department of Surgery at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine from 1978 to 2001, 23 years. The average turnover for a chairman of surgery is about 5 years. After leaving Cincinnati in 2001, he became the William V. McDermott Professor of Surgery at Harvard Medical School and Chairman of the Department of Surgery and Surgeon-in-Chief at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston from 2001 through 2008. Dr. Fischer's research interests have included medical ethics and surgical education models, hyperalimentation and surgical nutrition, enterocutaneous fistulas, and muscle protein turnover and sepsis. In 1999, he was one of 24 surgeons in the United States recognized by the journal Archives of Surgery for having made, quote, significant contributions to surgery in the areas of research, clinical care, and surgical education, end quote. Joining me today to interview Dr. Fischer is another eminent surgeon, Dr. Michael Edwards, current chairman of the Department of Surgery at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. Let's join them. It's a genuine honor for us at the Winkler Center to have with us today Dr. Josef Fischer, formerly Christian R. Holmes Professor of Surgery and Chairman of the Department of Surgery at the University of Cincinnati, and former Chairman of the Department of Surgery at Beth Israel New England Deaconess in Boston until 2008. With me to interview Dr. Fischer is Dr. Michael Edwards, the current Christian R. Holmes Professor of Surgery and Chairman of the department. Joe, you have an absolutely amazing career as a surgeon and educator. 860 articles, 50 visiting professorships, editor of at least 10 books that I'm aware of, and chairman of so many committees, important national and regional committees that I can't keep count of them. And I think another thing that's important for people to realize that through your mentoring, many of your young staff members in your departments and your residents have gone on to quite a claim of their own. You were born in New York City, May 7th, 1937, and we know you're here this week to honor your parents with a visiting professorship, which you do every year. Can you tell us just a little bit about your family and any siblings you had?
Well, my father worked in the family business, which he actually ran. My mother was a housewife, a very bright one. The plant was the ancestral business in Europe, and my grandparents left in 1915, actually October 1914, because they were afraid of the first Russian offensive. They were then in Austro-Hungary, and everybody knew what a Russian offensive was if the Russians won, and as a matter of fact, they were very successful. They took over whole areas of the 5 fortresses which separated Russia from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it wasn't until Ludendorff moved the Eighth Army from the Western Front to the Eastern Front that he stopped them. But in the interim, I mean, villages were pillaged, women were raped. I mean, that's what the Soviets did. And that's why in October 1914, despite the fact that the family had an excellent business, and they did business from Kiev to Berlin, they left with one suitcase. Fortunately, my grandfather had the foresight to bring a worthless Austrian war bond that said, in which the denomination was 25,000 Austrian marks. So it looked like a big deal, but it was absolutely worthless. And when he got to Ellis Island, they asked him for evidence that he had $25, which he didn't have. But he reached into his pocket and pulled out this worthless Austrian war bond that pointed out to the person interviewing him the 25,000. It was yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir. And they started out like many immigrants did, penniless, basically. My grandmother was a very smart lady. They lived in the Lower East Side, and while my grandfather did various odd jobs, she pushed a pushcart. And then she figured that there was no reason for her to push a pushcart, that she organized a group of 10 pushcarts, and she did the buying, and all the other ladies pushed the pushcart. And she was a remarkable lady who died about at the age of 88 of cancer of the pancreas, and actually gave my wife her ring. And then as soon as they made a little money in the business, my grandfather had 5 brothers. He bought them over successively. And they moved out of the area to a place where there were good schools. This is what all the other immigrants did. I know where they lived. They lived in a basement apartment. And my grandmother took in boarders. They had 2 whole rooms. But that was not unusual for that time. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't long before, with 3 other brothers, they had established the business again. They made a lot of money in the Depression because it was the old business of hides and skins and butcher wastes and the manufactured tallow for soap. And unfortunately, there was a falling out between 2 of the brothers and my grandfather and his brother. And so they built a new plant, not far away, but the plant was not, they didn't have enough business for the overhead of the plant. It was too big. I actually worked there for 2 summers when I was in medical school, driving a relief truck, 5-ton truck in New York City, which wasn't too much fun. It started at 6 o'clock in the morning and you got back 6 o'clock in the evening. And my helper, who helped load the truck, started out with 3 quarts of Schaefer beer under the seat and spent the day telling me how bad Schaefer beer was. So I asked him why he drank it, and he said, because it's cheap. Okay. I said, I know you get paid enough to buy better beer. But he never stopped complaining. Anyway, they then went into real estate. There was always a disagreement in the family as to whether my father should be paid more because he actually ran the factory, he ran the business, he ran the real estate. It made things somewhat unpleasant. I have 2 brothers, one of whom, my youngest brother, who's 15 years younger, is a world-famous historical sociologist. He runs around the world talking about the sociology of religious extremism. And as you might well imagine right now, it's a hot ticket, and he, I think his doctoral thesis is about to be published by the Oxford University Press, but he works with the Cardozo Law School and with Berkeley, UCLA Berkeley and Emory, so he comes here fairly frequently, to Boston. My other brother worked for the city of New York as an associate construction supervisor, and he's about 7 years younger than I am. So the family was actually a pretty big family from the standpoint of people surviving. And I still see cousins. And I have written with another cousin of my granduncle what I know of the family history. It's too bad that on Friday afternoon when my grandfather and my great uncle would tell stories of the old country that I didn't write them down, because it was really funny. And but I do remember some of it.
From a background of being an immigrant family, you went to Yeshiva College.
I was expected to.
Oh, you expected to, graduating summa cum laude.
Right.
Then you headed off to Harvard Medical School, where you graduated magna cum laude. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then you did your internship and residency at Mass General.
That's correct.
Mass General must have been a really exciting place in the 60s and the 70s.
It was, and it was a very interesting place. To a certain extent, they did not allow people of my background until maybe 1956. Dr. Churchill, who was one of my mentors, was very fond of the Middle East and Arabic history. He used to make a pilgrimage to the Middle East once a year, and he dragged back somebody that he thought was reasonable to try and educate as a surgical resident. Now, in medical school, I had already gotten after third year, I had already gotten a slot in the Department of Medicine at the Mass General. One of these boy wonders that Dr. Churchill dragged back was the crown prince of the nomadic Gashgai tribe in Iran. They were in this country because his father had tried to knock off the Shah of Iran, which was looked upon not with great favor. So, and this is a nomadic tribe of 500,000 people. So they had money. He's very handsome, very well educated, very urbane. And Abi, or Abdullah, the way we had it arranged was he was the junior resident on the female side. So we had 7 residents on the service. There was a chief, and then there were 2 seniors, 2 juniors, and 2 interns. And then there were medical students. Unfortunately, the MGH rotation was pretty lousy, so I was the only medical student in the surgery. I got the short straw. When we went down to eat after the day, and then we made rounds later, so you got out about 9 or 10, we all got on the doctor's line down in the cafeteria. Food was free. And Abby got on the nurse's line. And that was the last we'd ever see of him until the next morning. So on his nights on, the female side was largely untended. And the chief resident, who was Jerry Austin, after about a week said, look, we got to have somebody taking care of the female side, because we had about 50 beds, and one side was male, one side was female. He said, why don't you take care of the female side? And you're on with Ben Giddis, who later went on to fame and fortune at the Brigham and at the Institute, what became the Salk Institute in La Jolla. And why don't you do what you can? And then when you get into trouble, call Ben and he'll bail you out. So I started doing cut downs and all sorts of things when people were in trouble. And I was having a pretty good time, and then Ben would come and rescue me. And at the end of the rotation, Jerry Austin approached me and he said, you know, you did a great job. Do you want to be an intern here? I said, in surgery. And he said, yes. I said, well, I think I do. So he said, I'll talk to Dr. Churchill. So that's how I ended up there. It was a series of events.
Hard work and fortuitous
Hard work and
circumstances.
fortuitous circumstances,
Yeah.
that's right. I also, Dr. Churchill met with the the third year students, and he asked us to do a book report on something. And I decided that I was going to do a book report on Avicenna, the great Arabic physician. And he gave me the book, and I wrote a paper on it, and he liked it, and he said, well, why don't you read this? So I would come back the next week, and so I also got to know Dr. Churchill, who was really one of the wisest people I'd ever met, and he actually did structure the rectangular residency. I know Hopkins has spent fame and fortune to say that they originated the surgical residency, and they did, except it was a different residency. They graduated one chief resident who'd been around for 10 or 15 years, and they went from being the chief resident when Dr. Halstead said they were ready to being a professor and chair of a department. And they were not interested in meeting the surgical needs of the country. And Dr. Churchill was. And it was unfortunate that when he stepped down, he did what he said he never would. And he went before the search committee and said that the person they had chosen would do a bad job and that he opposed him. And they did choose Paul Russell. I think Dr. Churchill's judgment was right, although Dr. Russell is a very distinguished surgeon in transplant. And he didn't appear in the hospital for 7 years. And then there was a fairly slick, I would say, move, and Dr. Russell got replaced. We don't have time to go into that, but and then the first week that Jerry Austin was the chief of the Department of Surgery, Dr. Churchill appeared once again in the halls, and he died about 2 months later of a heart attack when he was up in Vermont. I think that was a great loss to the institution.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were head of the hyperalimentation laboratory at the Mass General, and then in 1978, you decided to come to Cincinnati. What in God's name possessed you to want to come to Cincinnati?
Well, I had been looking at chairs since I was 4 years out. Mm-hmm. I mean, hyperalimentation was very hot. And here again, this is serendipity. There was a intern by the name of Ron Abel who came from the University of Pennsylvania. And he was in the next lab to Stan Dudrick when Stan Dudrick was doing the puppies and then did the baby, which really made hyperalimentation. And he was my intern in 1966 when I was chief of pediatric surgery, or the chief resident on pediatric surgery with the redoubtable Hardy Hendren. That in itself could take up quite a bit of time. And he kept on telling me about all of this stuff that Stan Dudrick was doing, and the puppies never ate, and they were the same size as the puppies that ate, and they looked normal. So at that time, the MGH was really a great place. You could basically do whatever you wanted to as long as nobody got hurt. I don't think we got any permission, but we invited Stan Dudrick to come up and talk. Ron Abel, an intern, myself, a third-year resident, and he came up and talked. And so he talked at the Bigelow Amphitheater. I don't recall that we ever asked anybody whether we could use this hallowed Bigelow Amphitheater. And then Stan stayed for about 3 days and taught us how to put in subclavian lines. A pharmacist who took an interest in this and saw its application actually agreed to make up the bottles after hours on his own time in the pharmacy. Learned how to do it, went down to Philadelphia, figured out how to do it sterilely, and started making hyperalimentation solution. And then we got the orders ready. I was still a resident. with Ron Abel and Bill Abbott, who later lost interest. And so before very long, Jerry Austin called me in, still as a resident, and said, I want you to run the hyperalimentation service. I said, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, I want the patients to get, I've read about it. I know the patients need to have good dressings, and you have to teach nurses, and you have to tell people how to do this. I said, so now I'm a senior resident, and I'm going to tell Dr. Claude Welsh, one of the really great surgeons of the century, how to take care of his TPN patients. Actually, Dr. Welsh was very supportive and served as a mentor for the rest of my life. And Dr. Linton disagreed about whether they needed dressings or not. He's a great vascular surgeon, but he went along. And then when I joined the staff, we were the second place that had a TPN unit, and I had 70 patients that I was taking care of. So about 1974 was the first time I looked at a chair. And I'd looked at about 20 or 30. So, I got to be pretty good at figuring out what was important. Now, why in God's name did I come here? Well, the first thing was that nobody was going to fight you for the principal hospital. Right. There weren't any faculty. You could have shot a cannon any hour of the day or night and never hit a faculty member. Second, there were enough, although the general, as they called it, every time I came to visit, I asked the taxi driver, I said, would you tell me if you were really sick, which hospital would you go to? And he would, at that point, turn around and said, you mean really, really sick? I said, really, really sick. Which hospital would you go to? And he generally would think for a while, and then said, I suppose I would go to the general. So I knew that if you could really straighten out some of the other aspects of the hospital, you actually had a chance. And then there were a lot of facilities around. I mean, there was the VA across the street. Again, nobody was going to fight you for the VA. At that time, in the late 70s, it was a great place for young faculty. There was a lot of research money, and it was right across the street. And Children's Hospital, of which at that time I was still the surgeon-in-chief, with an enormous endowment. And so I thought that it was the best opportunity that I had seen thus far. Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, it was getting a little tired at the MGH. I was working very hard. I was spending about 50 hours a week in the OR. I had this huge service that I was overseeing, but by this time I had a lot of fellows and TPN nurses, but I still had to run it. And the chief had refused to give me a partner. And I had a lot of grants, and it became very clear that unless I had a partner, I was going to lose everything. I was going to lose the grants, I was going to lose the whole service, I was going to lose my family. And so I decided that it was time to take the plunge, which I think for me was very fortunate. Mm-hmm. And so I came here.
And we'll get into that. Michael, have anything you can add to that? As a new chairman, you know the drill?
I think I do know the drill. When you made that big leap, Joe, you had quite a presence that you had evolved in terms of the leadership in the broader field of surgery, and by that I mean nationally. You've always been active in national organizations and have made a great personal sacrifice to promote surgery and to promote the interest of surgery for surgeons, but more importantly, patients in the community. I guess I would begin by saying that as a surgeon, I owe you a debt of gratitude and thanks for what you've done for surgery throughout your career.
Thank you.
I'd like for you to comment about your role in the American College of Surgeons. You started at the lower levels and you rose to become chairman of the Board of Regents.
Right.
You've been one of the most influential voices in the world of surgery in the past, certainly the past 25 years. And, but a lot of challenges still face the College of Surgeons today. And I'd like for you to comment about anything you think is important with regard to history or where we stand today.
Well, I think that surgery, I have been always interested in whether or not surgeons are professionals or whether they're employees. Because when you're an employee, I mean, there was a wonderful review from two people from your department, Wes Alexander. You were a co-author.
Right.
About 18 different ways you could decrease surgical site infection, which is one of the huge problems we have in surgery. An employee is never going to help those things being instituted because they work a shift and they go home. Oh, hey, I want you to stay for, we have a meeting, it's important for the OR, and so, look, my shift is over. The other thing is this business of acute care surgery, I think, is ultimately going to be a disaster because there's no continuity of care. We had a little thing last night at our local museum, and the Rose Nichols Museum, and it was about e-publishing. And there were a number of people, somebody from NPR was there, the head of the Boston Library, which has 20 million pieces of either books or ephemera or manuscripts and stuff like that. Somebody else who is head of the Brattle Bookstore, which is really a great bookstore that has maybe 2 million volumes, valuable volumes. And then somebody who was head of a publishing company. And at dinner, I sat next to a young woman who was a consultant, very bright, actually had been at my home in the morning for the board meeting of the Beacon Hill Garden Club, which is sacred, and I can't say anything about it other than Karen got the Temple Award this year as being in charge of the tours. And you laugh, and I laughed, until they gave $55,000 to the city to redo the granite fountain on the Boston Common, all from these $30 tickets so I keep my mouth shut, but they weren't too cheap to give her the silver vase, and that only stays for a year and then goes to somebody else. But she had just had an experience at the Mass General with acute care surgery. And her mother had been there with a leaking colon, and every day there was a new surgeon, and they couldn't. And finally, she said, "Enough! This woman's going to die, unless I get a surgeon who will know her and take care of her, and see her through this." And that's what she did. She was smart enough. She was well connected enough. And we're helping people become employees. I know David Hoyt, the executive director of the college, told me very proudly that there were 1,000 people there when the trauma meeting was held in Chicago. And I said, "I'm sorry to burst your balloon, but this acute care surgery is going to be the death of general surgery." I think more than 50% of the surgeons are.
Could you speak then about the professionalism that is the surgeon? You've written extensively about the role of the surgeon to the patient in the community.
Right.
Comment about your vision of what services the surgeon should be providing.
Well, I think you just go back to what the definition of a professional is. A professional, if you really are a professional, or if a profession has what it should be, sets its own rules of behavior, disciplines those that are not in accordance with that behavior, sets its own reimbursement, always with a patient is the person who takes care of that patient 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, if you have coverage, you have coverage. But again, it is within the confines of what a professional does. And a number of other things that a professional has to do in response to being a professional, taking care of the indigent, not worrying about whether or not the indigent can pay you or not. We've always done that. And whether or not you take responsibility for areas, for example, a neurosurgeon who has 2 hospitals widely spread, and that's a problem, but somehow you got to figure out how to do it. We're no longer professionals. We don't set our own reimbursement. We don't have, acute care surgery, which is the hottest thing since sliced bread, is now that you're on for 8 or 12 hours or whatever you are, and then there's a handoff. And you can see at Mortality Morbidity Conference that there are errors being made because the handoff with residents is not perfect and the handoff with attendings is not. How much is a little bit of abdominal tenderness? And people die. I've seen people die at M&M because they were tender a little, and the next day they were much more tender. But the new person on didn't really understand what tenderness was there yesterday and how this was different and how this was worse. So, and the college really dropped the ball. The college could have intervened years ago. I spent 20 years on the Coding and Reimbursement Committee, and I kept on saying we have to fight hard to maintain our reimbursement. Actually, when I was chair of the Board of Regents, before that, I had actually hired one of the best lobbying firms in Washington that was really capable of doing stuff. One of the people in the firm, when we had a problem with rural surgery, went with me to see Max Baucus, Senate Majority Leader. We didn't have to see him in the hall. We went back to his office. I had salted it by getting a surgeon in Bozeman, Montana, to give him a list of how many hospitals in Montana had closed. Now, he knew him, and we started talking, and I said, so-and-so has given you a list of the hospitals that closed in Montana, and this March you'll get an update. And then I leaned forward and invaded his personal space across the table, and I said, Senator, who's going to take care of your constituents when these hospitals continue to close? And he had a very good health aide, who's now a senior vice president of a good lobbying organization, who got tired of poverty. And he said, Senator, you really have to do something about this. And that's how the 10% bonus for each CPT code for rural surgeons came about from that meeting. But most of the people said what we had to do was be good little surgeons, and we talk about quality, and we don't get to be obnoxious about money. I said, if we don't get obnoxious about money, we're not going to have anything left, which is what happened. And so the next step is the 5.8% decrease in surgical providers to pay family practitioners. Not that family practitioners shouldn't be paid better than they are, but another 6% with an inexorable decrease. We're not going to have any people going into general surgery.
As you think about people going into general surgery, you've talked about this transition of surgeons moving from a profession to being employees of systems and the potential ramifications of that. Could you comment about the training of surgeons and what you see in terms of the evolution of the changes in training as it relates to subspecialization, work hours, anything else that you think might be important?
Well, I don't blame people for not being a general surgeon. I mean, 80% take fellowships now when they finish general surgery. There are several reasons for that. First of all, I don't think they feel that they're very well trained. The data, as far as their experience that the American Board of Surgery collects, indicates that they don't really know what to do when they're so dominated by laparoscopic surgery in most programs that if they're confronted with an open abdomen, they have not a clue. And they have to get, quote, the open surgeon in the hospital to come. I do spend a little bit of time defending surgeons who injure common ducts. And most of them, the ducts that are injured really are anomalies. And when the plaintiff's attorney says to me, well, why didn't they convert? And I said, because they're terrified. I've heard stories of surgeons in Iraq, doing damage control procedures, closing, and then taking out a laparoscope so they can fix the problem. I don't know if that's true or not, but I hope not, but I can almost believe it. So the training is a problem. And the work hours, which I know Chuck Seisler very well. He's been supported entirely by the trucking industry. I got an email from him the other day that he is now having a course in work hours in some wonderful place in the Bahamas. I've forgotten exactly which. But he's been a tireless advocate for lower hours because of the model he uses at the Brigham, which is unsupervised interns taking care of the ICU without any senior residents or faculty. And after a little exchange between himself and myself, he went to the chief of medicine, who's Victor Zhao, who's now, I think, provost or something in Duke, and got it changed so he actually had senior resident coverage, and actually things got better. And then the new chair came in and said, no, we're going to have interns in the medical ICU. So it's the worst possible model. I think, and there are a number of people who did, I think about 20 years ago, some genius got the idea that if surgeons were no longer professionals, they'd be easier to deal with, and as employees, they could be controlled easier. And whether or not that's true or not, or whether I'm just being paranoid, which is possible, they've accomplished that. And I think, unfortunately, the public at large is going to be damaged. And the various fracticide that has taken place at the college, the last of which was Leza Greenfield, who was the most pro-woman surgical chair, and being garroted essentially for stupidity. It's very badly handled. A number of people are not coming to the college this year, including John Cameron, my good friend, former chair at Hopkins, who said, I don't know if it's going to make any difference, but this is a protest. So what's happened with the college is the college has basically lost its leadership in Washington. I mean, the American Surgical has now essentially taken over. When I was chair of the Board of Regents, I wanted to get Dick Knapp, who you know very well,
Right.
who was
Great
well, not only a great guy, but very smart, 40 years as the executive director of the AAMC,
Right.
with a Rolodex better than anybody else in the country
In medicine.
in medicine, and he is now helping. I mean, the new residents that we've gotten from the feds is basically Dick Knapp's doing.
So you do see nationally a trend toward a greater leadership role on behalf of our most prestigious society, the American Surgical.
Yeah, I think you can thank your mentor, Hiram Polk, for that. The meeting about what we would do at general surgery, which just appeared,
Right.
I was at. There were about 20 people there. It was basically an American Surgical meeting.
Right.
David Hoyt, the executive director of the college, was there, didn't say anything, wasn't asked to say anything. And I think the outcome of that meeting, except for one thing that I wanted, and that's 3 months of training for general surgeons in interventional radiology, got done.
I'd like to bring you back to Cincinnati
Yeah.
for a minute. When you arrived in 1978, as I recall, you had two major things to do. One, build a department. Two, convert the general into the university hospital. The department then was based on a geographic full-time model where as you say, the faculty weren't always around. And so you actually had to develop a practice plan and get full-time people working in the department. What were your biggest issues with that and with trying to convert the general to the university?
Well, let's take the general first. I was fortunate enough to have Vito Rollo, who I still talk with, who's back in Boston, after his restaurant on Cape Cod failed, who actually saw things the way I did. And he was a great help.
He was the hospital
He was the hospital
administrator.
administrator. The people who were most opposed to converting the general to a real hospital were the nurses.
Really?
And when we tried to get them to break up the 5 bedrooms, it was hell to pay. And I don't blame them. I mean, they could walk in a room and they could look around and see. It was like in the old Bullfinch building on the medicine service, where there were about 40 people in the room, and just look around, see who was dying and who wasn't. So what I did was I asked Vito if he would give me a wing. And I would appoint the nurses. I would control who practiced there. And we would have single bed or 2 bedrooms. And it wouldn't be any different than the rest of the wings. And we get private patients to come. Now, the people who went around and pushed the carts were really opposed to this. And I was told by one of the leaders of the African American community, who I think was way off base, that I was trying to take away their clubhouse. And I said, this isn't your clubhouse, this is a hospital and there are patients in there. And actually, I told Vito, I think it was, or a subsequent administrator, when we were looking around to save money, I said, look, why don't you do away with the 3rd shift? You know, I'm in here a lot at night, operating or going to the office or something. I'll do what the 3rd shift does. Just tell me point out to me where the various cleaning carts are. I'll take them out. I'll set them up in the middle of the hall. I'll turn on the radio to its blaring. And then when I go home, I'll take the cart and put it back.
Which was already happening.
This was already happening. And we actually did cut down the 3rd shift to 2 people, and we didn't notice any difference. So the facility, you remember the old OR.
Oh, yeah.
And so what I had to do was recruit a new faculty, and I had figured out exactly what I needed. And they actually told me they were going to give me the money. I did not try and do anything to the people who were sort of full-time, but separately, but geographic full-time. And actually, the process took 10 years. And my good friend Henry Neal and my good friend Wes Alexander were the last 2 after 10 years. And the process was essentially complete, but then you had this plastic surgery division in which everybody else was full-time, but the chief wasn't. So I asked Henry to come in and see me, and I said to Henry, it's time for you to go full-time. And Henry was, president of the Plastics Society and the head of the RRC and all that stuff. And I said, it's time for you to go full-time. And he said, and if I don't? I said, I'm going to fire you. And he said, I think you mean that. I said, in fact, I do. Yeah. And he went full-time. I think Henry Neal was the best vice chairman anybody ever had.
Oh, absolutely. He was part of your kitchen cabinet.
He was part of the kitchen cabinet, but the other thing was, being a juvenile diabetic, he had to eat. So he'd go down to the faculty dining room, which I did get out of Vito, so the faculty could eat there. And he'd listen for minute disturbances in the force, and he'd take care of it. And then Henry never made an appointment. Henry would find out when it was free. He stalked into the office and would tell me what happened and what he discovered and how he fixed it. And he said, "Do you want me to do anything else?" I said, "No, there's no reason for me to do anything." I still talk to him about once a month. In Montreat, he's a general practitioner. He carried his stuff in 2 paper bags until the town got together and got him a leather doctor's bag. He's enjoying it immensely. He's never charged anybody.
Right, it's all for free.
It's all for free, and he's having a wonderful time. And I missed his completion of his chair, which I think is terrific.
Yeah, no, it's
And
great.
Wes Alexander, too.
Oh, true,
Was
yeah.
the other one.
And I think Jim Hurst was one of your kitchen cabinet too.
Yeah, Jim Hurst, Bob Bauer,
Bob, yeah, right.
Glenn Warden, whose daughter, unfortunately, I got called on Thursday from Glenn his daughter has rapidly growing neoplasm of the right colon, and she lives right near Stanford, so I got a hold of the chief of colorectal. And I must say, they were very efficient and very nice. Let's see, who else? Was Mike Nussbaum? I don't know.
Yeah, well, he was one of
Later.
your residents.
Yeah, later.
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 Yeah, very.
But it was a great system. I mean, you know, well, I think 6 or 7.
Well, I don't think people realize with the new university hospital exactly what the old one was like, nor did they recognize the department as it is now. I mean, it's tremendous strides.
Yeah, I mean, we were fortunate.
You and I were the first 2, the only 2 people here on a regular basis.
I mean, we were fortunate in which we had Dr. Barrett, who was a strong supporter of the new university hospital, finally.
Right.
But they were going to build a addition to the Holmes Hospital. And I thought that was, when I came, and I thought that was ridiculous to spend $14 million or something like that on it, because there was no heavy radiology, there was no intensive care unit. It couldn't possibly ever be a university hospital. Anyway, I'd been here about 3 months, and I got a call from Dr. Barrett's office. I had not met him. And so I went down to Western Southern, and he greeted me, and I sat down. And he said, "You look like a nice young feller." I'll never forget this.
Can you tell us about your relationship with Dr. Altmaier?
Well, my relationship with Dr. Altmaier, I thought, was pretty good. Dr. Altmaier was very concerned about the new full-time practice plan. He was very concerned about my desire to concentrate the people, the faculty on this side and not use the Holmes office, which I thought was inadequate and was really separate than the department. But I left that alone and sort of died on its own. He's an interesting man. I mean, he obviously was a real leader in American surgery, whether he was president of the SSAT, he was president of the college and president of just about everything else. He didn't think that the full-time system would work. And I would go down to his office every 3 weeks. Well, first of all, it was the idea of letting him keep his office. There was no question in my mind which he thought was his office. It was the one in the Surgical Research Building, which was plaster walls and a shower and all of that stuff, and then the cinder block thing in the Medical Science Building. But offices are offices. You just knock down walls and you just make an office. And so I came in September, and at the college, which was in October, I heard this voice behind me that was Dr. Rhodes, Jonathan Rhodes, who was his very good friend, and he had sent his son train here. And he just said to me that it was very nice of me to let Bill keep his office. For the first 8 or 9 months, he would tell me how great he was, which is what he did.
Right.
And then finally I said to him, Dr. Altmaier, I know you're a great man. I need some help from you as far as advice. And he said, fine. Why don't you just ask me what you want? I did do what you're trying to do, and try and get an oral history from several of the old-time faculty. But unfortunately, with the exception of Bill Culbertson and a couple of others, it turned very vituperative, and I destroyed the tapes because there was such hard feeling, bitter feeling, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, very.
Yeah. But after a while, you know, the department came together. We had great people. I mean, the geographic full-time guys who remained full-time pitched in. We never changed their status, but people like Bill Fullen and some really good surgeons really contributed. We had a terrific residency, and they're still here. They're a good part of your faculty.
Right. Well, I couldn't let this pass without asking you about the relationship with the vice presidents. The vice presidents of the medical center.
Well,
and you don't have to use any names. if you
no.
want to.
Well, the critical issue there was the Medical Center Fund, in which once we had a practice plan, we had to have a place to keep the money. And there was no place to keep the money. And then I discovered in about 1982 that there was this entity that had been called the Medical Center Fund, which was supposedly the repository for private practice patients who had wandered into the Cincinnati General by mistake. So it didn't have a lot of money in it. But it did have some very interesting features. First of all, it was made up of the chairs of the departments. And secondly, the trustees were going to indemnify for any problems that the fund had as far as money was concerned. So there was a place to keep the money. And there was also the ability to have a board. Now, there was a board, but it was a very weak board. And so when we changed, I forget who did this with it, maybe Dan Gall did it, who was...
Probably Dan.
We fired the board. I don't know whether we were allowed to fire the board, but they stayed fired. And then I figured if we ever got any money, we would have to have it professionally managed, and that was relatively easy. But we would have to protect it from the university. Because if we were successful, it would be ultimately, as it was, the largest amount of money that was undesignated in the university. By that time, I had become friendly with a number of people downtown, become a member of the Commonwealth Club. And so we had the people like Jerry Durbin, who was the senior executive vice president of Procter & Gamble, who is still a very good friend. And he was the chairman of the board, and we had about 5 others, Larry Keller, and let's see who else, John Barrett.
John Barrett.
So the money was safe.
Right.
I mean, there were a couple of runs on it that I went up to see one of the vice presidents, and Jerry Durbin came with me. And shall we say the meeting ended badly, but the money stayed in the Medical Center Fund. And we were able to protect it. You know, I was chair of surgery. I served at the pleasure of the vice president. And so I could not protect it. The board had to protect it.
Right.
Clem Binger was also a member of the board. And
Fifth Third Bank, right?
The Fifth Third Bank.
Right.
And what was interesting, when he died, the first thing that was mentioned in his obituary was that he was a member of the board of the Medical Center Fund, which I thought was remarkable, since he probably had written that himself.
Mm-hmm.
So that, the money was the issue. And as long as I was around, they weren't going to get the money. So when it was time, 65, it wasn't going to be, allegedly it was cast in stone, but it really wasn't. And the vice president did not want me around.
Mm-hmm.
I think he wanted them. Well, he had demonstrated any number of times that he wanted the money. And just then the BI Deaconess got into really bad trouble and was losing $1 million a week. And so I went back against my better judgment whether or not I was going to go to that institution, because that had, I believe that institutions have things that are in the walls. The MGH had, at least when I was there, and for a little time after that patient care was paramount, and that was in the walls, and you couldn't get it out of the walls. Right. And patient care, which is what I was interested in, was not part of the walls of the Beth Israel Hospital, which was the surviving member. It was really a takeover of the Deaconess. The real reason I went back was because of Nantucket.
Mm-hmm. Which is a nice way to go back.
Which is a nice way to go back. The CEO finally, 8 years later, and I finally parted ways when we were supposed to build a 300-bed tower on the Deaconess side with new operating room. The operating rooms on the west side, which is where we did the big surgery, were 400 square feet. And having built ORs here 3 times, they were wholly inadequate. And first of all, since it was on the Deaconess side, the old BI mafia, the board mafia, would not let it be built on the west side. There was no place to do it on the east side. And so he built a research building just at the time when the spent $100 million on that. I warned him at the board that an 8.5% payout was not sufficient to support the building. He said, our scientists can get it. The first year deficit was $29 million, and they finally sold a good part of it. But it was enough damage that we couldn't build the ORs and we couldn't put the campus together on the west side. So we parted ways.
Mm-hmm.
Never forgave me for speaking against the research building at the Board of Trustees, or what, Board of Directors, Board of Trustees. And then, of course, he had this very flagrant dalliance with the young woman who worked for him and finally got fired.
Mm-hmm.
At least they said that they started this thing about, well, I'm 60 years old, I was riding my bike in the Atlas Mountains, I got to figure out what I want to do. So he got a $1.6 million severance, and the newspaper reporter who does medicine said, now wait a minute, you don't get a severance if you resign.
Right.
It finally came out, the board fired him.
Mm-hmm.
So now, 15 senior and senior level and mid-level people have left, including one guy who was really the sole, Frank Pompicelli.
Mm-hmm.
went to, so the whole department's gone essentially. There.
Now, do you still have your appointment at Harvard?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yep, still working.
McDermott Professor?
McDermott Professor. Just finished the 6th edition of Mastery of Surgery.
Right, knew that.
Should be out, part of it by the end of October when the college is. And one of the things I'm working on with the people out of the American Surgical is, and Mike had the first meeting in his conference room, is the fact that there are now 2 surveys that indicate that 40 million people are going to lose their employment-related health insurance. And they're going to have to pay in cash. They're going to go bankrupt. The middle class will not be able to afford surgery in an institution like this, or in Beth Israel Deaconess, or the Mass General, or the Peterborough Brigham Hospital. I mean, the laparoscopic cholecystectomy costs about $3,000. I don't know how much this hospital charges, but the Beth Israel Deaconess charges $19,000. Because surgery is paying for everything else. So that we have now, 2 years later, we've actually worked it up fairly well. We're getting help from one of the big consulting firms that is now donating their time and working with the business community to see whether or not this is feasible. What we need is a pilot program. And one of them, I won't say who it is, but it's the president of one of the major business organizations has promised that we will get the help to see if we can set it up. My son also is sort of gotten involved because he works with a lot of the major corporations. So I'm spending a fair amount of time on that and practice, and I have a break for about 2 years from the 7th edition of Mastery of Surgery, which I've contracted to do. And also I'm going to do a book on, started out as Anatomy for Surgeons. But since, my son again brought this up, who actually runs Global Aerospace and Defense for Booz & Company in Washington, as to whether or not there is a wider group. I mean, do medical schools teach anatomy? Not much.
Some of them not at all.
Some of them not at all. And we're in the middle of trying to find out. So I've changed the target a little bit from anatomy for surgeons to anatomy which would be accessible for medical students who I really do think need to learn anatomy, regardless. And my son is familiar with Becker, you know, the company that does that. His wife is taking a CPA exam. And he says, well, you know, maybe 2,000 people in the country, you know, take the CPA, and Becker is making lots of money from this, so why can't an anatomy book? Unfortunately, there are some of the publishers who are really firmly mired in the 15th century before the Gutenberg printing press. I mean, they have not a concept of how to do any, so we got to find a company that really has some things about it.
You have another question?
Yeah.
I'm fine.
Well, Joe, I feel very remiss if I didn't ask you about your lovely wife, Karen, who, word is out, she's going to be canonized.
Well, I'll tell you, it's the smartest thing I ever did.
You met her at Mass General,
I
didn't
met
you?
her, she was a social worker, and I was trying to get some poor lady out of the hospital because Art Bowie, who was my chief resident, told me if I didn't get her out of the hospital to a chronic hospital, that was my bed and I wouldn't operate until she went. And it was a weekend, and Karen was on call. She liked to do rehab. And so I put in a stat call for social service, and in flounced my wife, and I use that term advisedly, very upset about being disturbed on a weekend, and especially since nobody could move out on the weekend. I said, I'm going to marry that woman, and 4.5 years later I did.
Yeah.
And that was 48 years ago.
48 years.
So Karen is very busy in the community. She recently got the Temple Award from the Beacon Hill Garden Club. We had the board meeting at our house yesterday, so on the way to all the things I would do at 8:30 meeting, I had to make another pot of coffee and get all the chairs out and stuff like that. And
As it should be.
yeah, right.
You mentioned your son Eric,
Yeah,
and you have a daughter,
I have a
Alexandra.
daughter, yes, and she is now a practicing veterinarian as a second career. When she worked for Scholastic, you know, the Lucky Book Clubs, and had a $40 million budget because she did all the buying. And when she was 27 and she had a meteoric rise, one day she walked into her boss's office and said, "I'm out of here." And she said, "Why?" He said, "Because the next step is corporate. That's about money. I don't care about money. I care about books." And she said, "What are you going to do?" "Well, I'm going to go out to Encinitas in California and surf for a year and then figure out what I want to do with my life." She always wanted to be a veterinarian. And after being out there for a while, in which she lived off freelancing and the rent of her apartment in New York, she called me up and she said, "I've decided that I've always wanted to be a veterinarian. Will you support me financially and emotionally?" So 2.5 years of sciences, 4 years of University of Pennsylvania vet school, a year of internship, and practicing very happily in Leesburg, taking care of the Westminster dogs.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they hang out.
Is it?
Yeah. Got married this summer. Eric got married last September to a very nice gal who works for Fannie Mae and tries to has a group of 25 that try and work out, you know, bad mortgages. I don't know how successfully. Alexander married a cardiac anesthesiologist at Fairfax, that 1,100 bed hospital.
Mm-hmm.
He was really a neat guy. I really like him.
That sounds great.
And so she is very happy practicing, and she's a good vet. I went to the office with her. So that's it.
Well, Joe, I'd like to thank you so much for coming today, that we could spend some time together. And Michael, thank you very much for being here. And this is another oral history program from the Winkler Center for the History of the Health Professions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.